Welcome to GovCon Unscripted, where we dive into the unfiltered stories and strategies from all around the world of government contracting. Join host Chelsea Roberts as she explores how to navigate, thrive, and win in this complex but lucrative industry.
Welcome to GovCon Unscripted. This is your host, Chelsea Roberts. Today's episode is a part of a series that we're calling Success After Service. We're featuring brilliant minds with wisdom to share from throughout the federal ecosystem, folks that served in the military and have transitioned out and found some success after their time, either in federal or military service. I hope that you enjoy this episode and the series, and if you haven't yet, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the podcast with your friends. All right. Hey, everyone, and welcome back to the GovCon Unscripted Podcast. I'm your host, Chelsea Roberts, CEO of Collaborative Compositions, and today I've got with us friend, colleague, and defense innovation evangelist, David Schiff. David, who are you and what do you do?
So, Chelsea, good to be with you. Thanks for having me on your podcast. I've been a longtime Navy officer, Navy acquisition professional, and then in the last few years, before my current role, I was really working at multiple defense innovation organizations, trying to help both the industry side and also the academic side of American capability with connecting with the Defense Department, now the Department of War, in meaningful ways that would make the department more productive, more collaborative, and also more efficient.
Yeah, I love the word collaborative, hence it's a part of my company's name. There was a time not so long ago, it didn't have the most positive connotation. And it was if you were a collaborator, if you collaborated, it was seen like a potential nation threat or some sort of treason, or there was some sort of just disastrous connotation associated with just the word collaboration. So I'm curious, like, what your thoughts are on the growing just use of that term and how you're seeing that kind of proliferate through the Department of War at this point, and how they're collaborating amongst themselves more effectively these days and how they're collaborating with industry more effectively.
Yeah, I think people think of defense secrecy and trade secrecy when they think of obviously violating those secrecies is problematic, clearly. And having had a clearance my entire adult life, I understand the concern there. But by collaboration, a lot of the folks you are talking with understand that there's a symbiosis that really makes us work better together. And it's the same symbiosis that enhanced the Manhattan Project and the space program, the creation of the internet. Obviously, all of those had connections to the Department of Defense. I think that it's like the combination of different kinds of deep research that you get from academia, and then the deep prototyping you get from the DARPAs of the world and the offices of Naval Research and Air Force Research Labs, similar to the medical industry, where you have to have people who are deep and broad working together. And the Department of Defense and Department of War now has a plethora of intelligence and capability. We don't know everything, and we don't have all the technology in our hands as we might have at one point. To me, collaboration means getting best practices and lessons learned from each other where classification is not an issue, and obviously in the right room with the classification as an issue. And what I was noticing in my Navy career was that I would talk casually with someone from the Army or someone from industry or someone from Johns Hopkins or Carnegie Mellon and find out that either the problem that we were discussing had already been solved by someone else in a similar arena and even a similar scale, or that we had the same problem and we could maybe help each other.
I think that hits the nail on the head in the way of information and just data silos that you see within the federal government across the board, whether it's FedCiv or whether it's Department of War. You have these silos that exist, and there's, at least fortunately, I think, for industry and for government alike, there's a growing recognition that those silos are not necessarily creating an ecosystem which you can thrive, which you can make progress, which you can really see the growth potential and opportunities. And it also prevents you from being able to effectively understand what sort of challenges others have met and dealt with and how they effectively negotiated those challenges and overcame those obstacles, then they might be super similar to what you're going through, like you said, in Army versus Navy or Air Force and Space Force. And I'm curious, so like with the standing up the Space Force within the last decade, do you see that there's been any sort of, being the new kid on the block, have they taken the approach of let's learn as much as we can from others' failures and not make those same mistakes going forward? Or do you see if they are the new sort of open enterprise on the block?
I do think that the newer the organization, the more willing they are to take calculated risks and try new things, learn from the either mistakes they've seen in the past with the prior branch. I think the Air Force learned a lot from the Army, and I think the Space Force is learning a lot from the Air Force and the rest of us. I know this because I have friends in the Space Force who are asking those questions, like how could we do better with human capital, or how could we do better with business process improvements? And it's, to me, really exciting. One of my friends in Space Force, Chang Su, he is really a believer in testing and experimenting and making sure that the Space Force gets it right. And I've met some of the generals in the Space Force when I was working at Ensign, which is under Defense Innovation Unit. And those generals just had a much higher risk appetite and much more interested in experimentation for the service itself. And then even listening to Guardians, whether it's about uniform changes or about the space, the office that they're in, or about UI and UX on satellite interfaces. I think that obviously the Air Force and Space Force, the newest branches, have a huge advantage in that sense, a little bit less constrained by tradition and history. Obviously, as a Navy guy, I love the history and the tradition. I also think it's good to always ask ourselves, are we doing this because it's the best way or because it's the way that we know?
And I think that it's a pretty common theme amongst folks within any branch of service these days is the generalized and growing realization that what got you here today probably won't get you where you want to go tomorrow.
Yeah, and I don't know if you remember, I started that Federal Innovators Salon back in 2020.
Yeah.
It's a meetup, but I started it because one of my friends at the Director of National Intelligence Office was hanging out at NavalX, and we were realizing how much we had in common as far as problems went. At the end of that chat, the two teams were discussing how we would solve some of each other's problems. I asked rhetorically, wouldn't it be great if we had something like this for mid-career professionals across the executive branch? And Katie Tobin, who was the OD&I person, said, why don't you create something like that? So we started it the next month, and right before COVID. We pivoted to mostly virtual, but it's been an amazing experience to see across many different agencies how much we have in common, what we can learn from each other. Obviously, we're looking at different budgets and different priorities, but some of the problems are almost identical.
And I think that's growing and relatively new realization across the services. But I feel like, for what I've seen at least, industry has been aware of common challenges and common issues across the board for many years, probably. And they're all in the situation of, hey, you've got the same problem that our friends over here at Navy or Army do. Here's how we're solving it for them. But then they get the sense of, that's not my problem. It's not my baby. You're not speaking the right language. You're not any sort of number of things. You're not communicating that to me effectively. So what do you want me to do about it? And how am I supposed to understand what your solution is to that problem? And how am I supposed to understand that might actually be my problem? So where are you finding that companies these days are able to fit in and help support the demolition of information silos? We'll just put it at that. How are companies able to support that these days?
Yeah, my impression was, prior to my career and into my first decade or so of my career, I think industry took advantage of those gaps and seams as opportunities to expand without necessarily conveying that information to the military. And
Sure.
that was what you would do as a business, but not necessarily optimized for the Defense Department or the taxpayer. I think that over time, whether it's, I don't want to call out too many big companies, but I think Microsoft and Salesforce and other companies that deal with more of our business side have seen, hey, we can really get, obviously for them, it's a huge gain for revenue, but for the military, it makes more sense to be aligned on certain things. And where I work now, Govini, I think we're working on the same mindset, which is we can help you specifically, but we can also show you what your partners across the street have done. And it's possible that your sharing of data with them and with us can optimize your entire problem, so that you're not just looking at a single missile and its supply chain, but looking across the entire weapons ecosystem. I think that there is much more appetite from the defense perspective to see if we could work together or could we get gains. I think in the weapons side, for example, I was the acting weapons analyst for the Navy for 6 months and on a rotation. And I saw a lot of joint programs that were doing really well between Army, Navy, or Navy and Air Force. And we need to improve that on the business process side and on the data side and on the cybersecurity side. And then thinking about your question from another angle, just as far as those gaps and seams, I think your point is some of these really great nice to haves are not funded per se, or not specifically appropriated. I think it's up to the program managers and leaders in the Pentagon to make sure that they are. Things like human capital issues always seem to fall by the wayside, just like facilities do. I think a better integration of those things into a whole system improvement would be great. I would love to see when we're going to build this, and this is a rumor I've heard from Air Force folks, that they build the golf course first, and then they say, oh, we're out of money, we're going to still need to build a runway. And I think that's a joke, but I do think that it's a good way to say, let's put our people first in facts, and then we'll put the weapon system in next, or the business process first, and then the weapon system. If we don't fund the foundational important things, we're not going to be able to retain the talent we need.
And talent retention has been one of those things that is constantly burdening the government. And especially within, I would say, the past decade, it's just become one of those almost insurmountable problems. You see the government saying, well, we need to attract the best talent. And it used to be, oh, we can attract them more effectively because we've got the longevity, we've got the security, we can provide that sense of stability for them. We might not pay the best, but we can bring them in, we can give them benefits, we can say, hey, you're going to have a job in 10 years, and give them that sense of security, stability, and of contributing to the mission. And now these days, there's a lot of churn. Frankly, there's a lot of churn happening, and there's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of instability happening within an industry, which I think everybody from the baseline just thought, okay, I'm always going to have this job. There's never going to be a threat to my job in this position. I think that it's equally right now challenging for industry because they don't know necessarily if they should be hiring the people that are coming out. They don't know if they should be leaning on their skills and resources or their network as much as they used to be able to, because they don't really know if their network's going to still be there in 6 months, if it's still going to be available. So it becomes a challenge for both sides of the fence of how does the government then put themselves into a position to attract and maintain and keep the best talent, while industry is on that same side of the fence of how do they go about doing that if they're not winning government programs, if their programs aren't paying as well, if they're not getting themselves into a position to work on the most exciting things at the national security level. Any number of problems go into that people problem and that human capital issue. So I think that's definitely a big area in which I see there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, and I think back to your comments about the industry piece is if we collaborate more between defense and cutting edge tech, the defense primes and the academic side. And what I've always thought of is like a positive revolving door, instead of it being like the revolving door of like in and out, it's more of the revolving door of we want our scientists and engineers to go hang out in the field with Marines and sailors and soldiers. And we want sailors, soldiers, Marines, airmen, and guardians to go try out industry positions and feel like, hey, actually, I need a little bit more experience in large language models. So I'm going to go spend some time with a company and come back. I think that payback tours, rotations with industry, and similarly, I think industry needs to understand the problem on the ground. And it's great to go to an exercise. It's great to go to Silent Swarm or to one of these massive joint exercises, but to spend a year with the military embedded is a different experience. And I don't think a lot of Americans actually understand the military that well. I think there are people in the military who don't understand the military that well. And then the academic side as well. I think that we should not write off the value of deep research or people with deep expertise. I think it's balance between all these things. And I think that's what we are desperately in need of these days is balance.
That's well said. I believe that is something that we have lacked for long enough that it's time to bring that back into perspective and understand the value of having some balance between the two. Because when you've got either side being on the upswing and the other side being on the downswing, you meet these chasms that I think we were just briefly talking about before we jumped on, which is it's things like the valley of death. If you've got companies that have great tech, they've got great people, but they can't figure out how to break into the military, they can't figure out how to break into those roles in which they can understand their customer better to the point where they can get it into the hands of their customer. You reach these things where it's, okay, we've gotten pretty far, but we can't get all the way across the finish line because we just don't have that understanding. We don't have the awareness of how funding moves and how we need to pursue that. And it becomes one of those chicken and egg tricky situations where you're like, do I need to go get an end customer before I have a product? Or do I need to go make sure I've got outside funding so that I can do any of these things? Like, how are you seeing companies cross that valley of death that is so often referred to in defense tech?
I think the companies that have obviously done really well have had huge backing and have done some of their IRAD and brought sometimes nearly complete opportunities or options to the table. Those are the, I'd say, the Andurils of the world.
I was going to say, the big billion-dollar founder companies.
Those are the big ones. If you can get that kind of VC or PE support at the beginning, that's really great. For the companies you and I have been advising for years, which don't have that money and don't have that kind of level of awareness and into the defense space, I think it's obviously much harder. I do see with the AI tools a lot of value there for a small company that can't staff at the same level as a Lockheed Martin, right? Yeah. I think that asking really good prompts about what are the best exercises for me to put my technology out there? What are the best contract vehicles for my size business? Is it a CSO, a SIBR? Should I go to an OTA consortium? I specifically have this kind of tech, or I'm a PhD and I'm interested in building this kind of tech. I think looking at those forums and using the AI tools to narrow it down for yourself, even with legal and contract support, obviously you at some point need a lawyer and you probably want to talk to a contracting expert, but those tools can save you a lot of time and a lot of cycles. And then I think that attending conferences that are human to human are going to be like the smaller conferences, usually not the big ones. I think you really need to be almost a conference expert to go to the big ones and get value. So I think that finding one, especially if you have a veteran on your team. I'm a Navy veteran, so if I go to a conference, I do know people at a lot of the Navy conferences. When I've consulted in the past, sometimes I'll go to a conference alongside the folks at that company to make sure that they at least are meeting the right people and asking the right questions and saving a little bit of time. When it comes to getting funding, I think that's where you probably want to look. If you think you have something really promising, there are a lot of venture firms that are defense focused now. And I'm friendly with some of those folks, and they're actually not that hard to find. But I do think that it takes a combination of all those things back to balance, which, by the way, is my dad's favorite word. How your parent always has one thing they say over and over. My dad, my sister and I always joke, like my dad's like, you know what I always say, and we know that the word will be balance. But I do think for a startup, a small business, a team of students who are trying to build something, I think really good discovery is going to save you a ton of time. And that discovery work includes both your internet-based discovery and with the AI tools. And then it also includes the human discovery, which means way more interviews than you think you need to do.
Yeah, I found that there's a lot of folks that they inadvertently, and I'm sure it's not intentional, but they just fall into that founder's trap of being told yes once and thinking that is the end all be all of all the approvals and justification validation that they need. And the folks that fall into that sort of pit of despair, which is being told no once and then being so discouraged from that one no that they don't go on to pursue other things. But talking about that venture thing, I was talking to a friend of ours, Luke Chabreau, yesterday and the day before, having this conversation about, is venture really what these companies need to be able to succeed? And I think there's a lot of arguments on both sides of that, which are, yes, it brings you a lot of funding, it gives you the runway, it gives you some capital to work with. with. It gives you a little bit of a security blanket and being able to last a little bit longer and take a little bit of time to do some of that deep dive, that research. And you don't have to necessarily be worried about being able to pay your people next month because you've got a little bit of capital runway to be able to take things a little bit farther. But on the other side of that fence, you've also got the folks that are pursuing a lot of these government things because, first of all, they don't want to dilute their company. So they're not interested in having dilutive funding, whether it be PE or venture or any other sort of investor relations that they might find, like loans or whatever, that they might find that they have offered to them. And they ultimately are pursuing some of these tracks because of the non-dilutive funding capability that they think that they might be able to access. So what's your take on that? Where do you find that there's really good value in providing venture? And do you find that the venture capital companies that you're having conversations with or that you're friendly with realize that the timelines that they probably have in their mind for returns are not necessarily aligned with the way that the federal government spends, and that might not be necessarily produce the returns you're looking for in the next year or so? It might be more like 5-10 year timeframes.
Oh, I think that there's nuance to this whole conversation when it comes to funding. There are definitely a lot of non-dilutive options from CIBR to CSO inside the Department of War. I'm going to get that wrong at least.
Oh, no
5%.
worries. Yeah.
But I think that you make a great point, which is you give up some control and you may be on a tighter leash, a tighter timeline when you're working with other people's money. So bootstrapping is the right answer for certain companies at certain stages. Just like you need, when you're a startup or small business, if you've done your discovery work and you think that you've got the pathways ahead of you, making sure that you have your authority to operate pathway and your funding pathway and your sponsorship, those are the three that I think you really need once you know that the signal is strong. So I think that funding pathway, to your question, I think that's definitely a very personal decision about that, again, balance between autonomy, which you have with bootstrapping, and runway, which you have with VC and PE. If I'm starting a business and I want the backing of a VC firm, I'm going to go to a firm that already prefers the defense sector and understands the POM cycle, understands CRs, understands the timeline so that their expectations are realistic for the turnaround. Versus I'm a product company in the commercial sector and I expect these returns in the next 4 quarters. Right? You can't expect that from a defense technology, for example, in most cases, right? And I want to pivot to those other two pathways, like the sponsorship. It's one thing to get an admiral or a general at AUSA, AFA, or Sierra in Space to say, this is great. Having that on your slogan, your bumper sticker at the bottom of a PowerPoint is one thing, but the person who actually makes the decision in most cases is a program manager at a program executive office. They're hard to reach. They don't always go to conferences. And what is the reality for most people is that it's not just the program manager who makes that call. It's a kind of a consortium of people. So you really do need to be tenacious and engaged and understand that network really well to get that sponsorship. But it is risky to pursue investments without the sponsorship you need. So I think that's in hand with your capital concerns should be, does anybody in the defense world actually want this? And would they actually back me if we got it to them? That's why the CIBR one, obviously, the phase 1 and 2 are experimental, and phase 3 is real true military sponsorship. And before this year, I was under the impression that phase 3s were basically ironclad, but even those have risk.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Those are, first of all, not guaranteed, which no. I think a lot of folks come under the impression that, okay, if I get a phase 1, I'm going to get a phase 2. If I get a phase 2, there's no way I'm not going to get this phase 3. It runs in there. But then there's so much misunderstanding about what a phase 3 is. And there's even biases throughout the Department of War that are like, I don't want anything to do with your CIBR. I don't want anything to do with CIBR in general, whether it's a phase 3 or not, even if it's not CIBR money, which doesn't go into phase 3s. So these folks that are under the impression that there's better ways and alternatives to finding and funding new tech, I think, at least now, as of probably just this year with the release of the executive order back in April, are looking at things like CSOs and BAAs and BPAs and some OTAs and all of those cases as the alternative to cyber funding. And I've talked to some folks within the SOCOM world, and they're even running their cybers kind of as OTA-based opportunities. So they're just calling them OTAs. They're calling them cybers, but they're really in reality OTAs, which make it a much more open and viable vehicle for things to progress on into that production level, which gets you into that sort of phase 3 environment. And it makes it a whole lot more open for colors of money, for other participation, for socializing those solutions across different problem sets throughout different agencies. So I think that there's been a push towards things that are more open, that are a little bit, and I don't want to say easier, because nothing in federal government I think will ever be really easy, but pushing it towards a more consistent and a less barrier-ridden sort of process for getting new tech into the hands of defense users. And it comes down to, at the end of the day, what new tech do they want? What new tech do they need? What are they planning for? And is the guidance that you hear from folks like CNOs, like in the NAV plan or in the Air Force's CCA roadmap, things like that, where are they really signaling with the tech that they're going to want in the next several years? And can you interpret that as such? Or is that even in flux and changing on the day to day? A lot of organizations are.
Yeah, I think that signal wise, I believe OSD, now OSW, R&E, research and engineering, had the 14 critical technology arenas. Those change. They're going to change again this year. The budget is really what you should be watching if you can get access to. Obviously, you have public facing budget, and then you have your J-books, and that's still public facing, but then you have deeper levels that you probably only have from insiders, and some of that is sensitive. Tracking that is where you'll see real signal changes. I don't see a lot of changes coming in things like autonomy, meaning I think it's a priority. So we're not going to see it downgrade. I don't think AI will downgrade. I think we're going to have to find ways to better connect to the public AI capabilities, because while I really respect AFRL's NIPR GPT, and I think Camo GPT, some of these things that Space Force was experimenting with last year, I think that the real capability is in the massive amounts of data. So we're going to have to find, again, a balance between the public tool that we all use and we know how capable it is, and these extremely firewalled off versions of a large language model that really don't scratch the same itch. So I think that's definitely a balance. And by the way, I think I'd mentioned 3 paths: the funding, the sponsorship, and then I talked about kind of to stay on this topic. Authority to operate is still a long, arduous path. I believe Katie Arrington and other folks at the Pentagon are trying to improve the risk management frameworks and the authority to operate pathways. I know that there are companies out there trying to help with this. It's still a real hurdle to get through, and it takes forever. The earlier you can get started on that, and the more you can actually be like, hey, we're 2 months away from ATO approval, is way better than, hey, we are thinking about ATO approval, right?
Yeah.
You know, it's one additional layer of difficulty being a tech company working with the military. And I think that obviously we have to come at it from both sides. The advice to a small business is work with someone who can help you with the cybersecurity piece and with the approval and the authority to operate. And then on the military side, we do need to find better ways to not shortcut, because you do want the security, but to make the entire process flow easily and be understandable. It's just, we're not doing anyone any favors the way we do it right now.
Yeah, and I think that comes down to, at least from what I've seen so far, a matter of inconsistency. And while the process is straightforward, it's a bajillion different controls you've got to be really aware of. You've got to take those all into consideration. You've got to apply them and put them into process and have them ranked and racked and stacked from your internal perspective. But on the government side, you walk into any sort of different like ATO situation across the board, and everybody does it differently. Everybody's got different preferences and biases and ways that they consider different controls. Some things are more important. Some people are bigger sticklers about other things. And it tends to be, even though it's something that it seems from just the process standpoint, pretty straightforward, pretty easy to understand,
Right.
when you walk into the situation, it just ends up being a different conversation. It becomes a little bit harder to navigate that ATO, and being able to reciprocity is one of those big words that I think has come into play like a lot of times with ATOs. Do we have reciprocity with the system? Is this going to be like CATOs, continuous ATOs? Is this something that we're going to be able to leverage on across the board? Or do we have to make sure that it's ATO'd by this office and this office, and everybody's got a different sort of perspective and philosophy on it? So that's one of those like conversations that seems like it should be really straightforward, but ends up being way more complicated than it really needs to be. So I think simplification in that realm, and not saying to weaken it or make it any sort of less robust from the process perspective, but putting it into a position in which there is some consistency and it's not unobtainium from
Yeah.
the small business perspective, is got to be something that's a priority for federal government. So I'm glad to see that is something that they're taking into consideration and moving
Yeah.
forward with.
I would even say, I think that when people say the word reciprocity, even inside a branch, we're talking about this morning with one of the branches, and it's like even inside one branch of service, there's not true reciprocity, which is frustrating. And then the other thing I think about coming from my last role, where we were trying to help modernize Navy HR, and even where I sit at Govini, data access and data flow is not as easy as it should be, even once you have an ATO. So I think that something that I would love for our defense partners to help us with is Zillow or Redfin with check boxes. I need this and this. I think that from a industry perspective, I can tell you which rows or columns of data I need. When I get the ATO and I have a sponsor, it should be pretty easy to get that data, and that is not always easy. And not as a complaint, just as okay, you want us to move fast on the industry side, you really need to have the data that will make what we're promising true. And if we don't have that data, a lot of the things, especially in the world of AI and machine learning, can't be true without the data. So it's one thing to have all the data in a spreadsheet or in a few major access tables, but really having APIs, that has to be the future for every defense organization. And within the bounds of security, there have to be APIs to your trusted partners. And back to our original conversation about collaboration, we can't be collaborating if I can't get data in a streamlined and trustworthy method.
And I think that I'm hopeful that's something that we're working on both industry and government side to make it a little bit easier for that communication and collaboration to happen across data silos that currently exist, and things that we can intentionally break those barriers for folks.
Yeah, by the way, one other thing I know is something you believe in and needs to be said is that a small company can use obviously an AI tool pretty easily. Another shortcut for a small business that they don't always consider is being a sub to a bigger business. And I think that it seems obvious, but if you can get accounting or HR or overhead support via being a partner or a sub, or even priming, but with a large business as the sub, those are shortcuts. And that way you can obviously write that contract really well, but make sure that you are compensated correctly. But I also think that small businesses don't necessarily have the bandwidth or the experience to deal with some of those larger overhead capabilities that an experienced company could help them with. And I think that if I were starting a company right now, I would be looking to AI tools for help on contracts. But again, I would then call Chelsea and be like, hey, can you give this a once over too? Because I know you've actually experienced this and you're not just an LLM.
Exactly. And there is danger to every action and every reaction that you're going to get. Working just only solely with an LLM, you're putting yourself into a position to have hallucinations, gaps, things that you can't really understand until somebody else's eyes on it to say, hey, you might want to just check that. Did you click that link and find out that it doesn't go anywhere? Or are the references that you're using real references? Are they square? Or are they being hodgepodged together between a couple of different things that don't actually exist? So there's definitely positives and minuses.
Yeah, I think the tools are most helpful when it comes to things like, I want to see what the trend is in quantum from NDAA 20 through NDAA 25, right? That is something that I don't have the money or the time to do myself. I can't hire that out. And getting that quickly is the kind of thing that obviously you're not as worried about. But yeah, when it
Yeah.
comes to your contracts, the legal language, that's why there are still human professionals we pay, right?
100%. 100%. I know we're getting a little short on time here, so I'm going to wrap this up with sort of one last overarching question that I know is going to have a longer answer. But looking ahead for the next 12, 18, 24 months, where and how should companies be positioning themselves to win, given the current environment, the landscape, the shutdown, the personalities, the whole government sphere kind of position in general right now? What should companies really be focused on?
It's a complicated and nuanced question.
Yes,
Try to
it
give a
is.
good answer for that, which is if you have something that you've built, whether it's hardware or software or other, and you believe in it and you believe that the Department of War needs it, then I would actually just stay the course. Just keep trying to do what you're doing, but with the things that we've had in this conversation and all the other conversations you've had as guidance, I would continue on that path, knowing that what you're providing is valuable. I would not try to pivot with the wind at this point, because you'll end up spending too many cycles and resources trying to chase something that's basically always vanishing, right? Which is certainty, right? So you're not going to get that.
Yes.
Yeah, you're not going to get it. So I think that you need to be confident in the thing that you're building and make sure that you're doing that discovery. And if you have people at multiple levels, both in uniform and out, those civilians make the decisions and usually provide that continuity. Their contractors do too in many cases. You need to have true sponsorship from a variety of people. This doesn't mean everyone at that organization, but don't just go after stars, right? Generals and admirals, very busy, get excited about a lot of things, but they're not always the decision maker about a specific tech insertion or a business process improvement. So finding the people who really are your customer, it takes patience and time. I recommend courses on human-centered design. I took some on IDEO and through UVA Darden, through what was Luma Institute. A lot of those things are online and can really help you improve your discovery skills. If you don't have someone on your team who does that, then you probably do need to hire that.
Absolutely. And I think that those are all great points. And pivoting with the wind, while there's plenty of folks advising that out there right now, I think it puts you into a position to, again, be chasing something that will always be consistently not there when you're trying to find it, which I love the way you phrase that. Certainty, it's the least resource that's available to you in any given situation. So I think that's something that folks are constantly waiting for and constantly searching for, but really realizing that uncertainty is the thing to adapt to and to recognize that the only constant in life is change. So
That's
understanding how to maintain and can keep that continuity within your business, your operations, and realize that, again, if you have something that's valuable, that there will be folks that will find value in it, so long as you can find them and get their hands on whatever that solution is.
Right. I'm not a country music guy, but I will say John Michael Montgomery said, life's a dance. You learn as you go. Sometimes you lead, sometimes you follow.
Yep, I love that. That's well put. And I have heard that there's probably any government acquisition could have a country song made up of it. With,
I can see that. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
a good comment. But yeah, I really appreciate you having me on your podcast today.
Yeah, this was a fantastic conversation, David. If folks want to reach out to you, how can they get a hold of you?
I'm David P. Schiff on LinkedIn. I check LinkedIn pretty frequently, and it's actually just probably the best way to reach me. And then I've been advising small businesses formally and informally for about a decade. And it brings me a lot of joy because I know that people have a lot of passion to help with our national security mission, with the rest of our federal agencies. And I always like being a translator between government and the private sector and the academic side too.
I love that. We'll get all of your contact info in the show notes, and folks that want to reach out to you and just shoot the shit or have a conversation about what their company's doing and how you might suggest that they go forward, or even bring you on as an advisor. We'll all have the opportunity to do that. So thanks, David. This was a great conversation. For our audience out there, don't forget to subscribe and share the podcast with your friends. And if you've got the time or energy, put a comment in either Apple Podcasts or Spotify. We'll always get back to you because that's the best way to get our podcast out there and get it into your other friends' ears. So thanks, David, and have a great rest of your day.
You too.
Thanks for listening to this episode of GovCon Unscripted with your host, Chelsea Roberts. Do you have a GovCon story or need guidance in government contracting? Connect with Chelsea on LinkedIn to be a guest on the show or to enhance your business strategy. Don't forget, your network is your net worth. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with your growing GovCon community.